Today we're tackling one of the absolute biggest, most complex mysteries of the modern world. You ever wonder why someone born in Denmark or Japan can expect a long, wealthy life, while someone born just a few thousand miles away might face extreme poverty? For centuries, historians and economists have all tried to crack this global puzzle. Why did some countries get incredibly rich, while others stayed poor? Well, spoiler alert, it's not just one magic bullet. It's this massive, fascinating tapestry, and we are going to unravel the whole shebang together.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, picture a very real city, Nogales. It's literally split right down the middle by the US-Mexico border. The northern half, in Arizona, is relatively wealthy, it's safe. But just right across the fence, the southern half in Sonora is much poorer, and it struggles a lot more with crime. Now here is the wild part. These people share the exact same climate, the same geography, the same ancestors, even the same culture. Yet, their day-to-day realities are just worlds apart. So to figure out why, we actually have to zoom way out and look at the invisible forces that built our world.
Part 1. The luck of geography, or what I like to call the starting hand.
All right, so our story actually takes us way, way back in time to the end of the last ice age. We're talking about 10,000 years ago, when humanity went through the agricultural revolution. But here's the thing, this didn't happen evenly across the globe. To start a farm, you really need nutritious, easy-to-store plants, things like wheat or barley. And as it turns out, the wild ancestors of these absolute jackpot crops were heavily concentrated in the Middle East, in a region called the Fertile Crescent. So right out of the gate, the people living there were dealt a massive historical head start.
And think about how rare this geographical luck really is. Out of all the thousands of large mammal species on planet Earth, guess how many were successfully domesticated by humans? Just 14. Literally, 14. We're talking about animals like cows, horses, and pigs that could actually pull plows and provide immense calories for the population. And almost all of them were native to Europe and Asia. Over in the Americas, for example, they only managed to domesticate the llama. And well, a llama just isn't pulling a heavy plow for you.
Now, this is where it gets super interesting. The actual physical shape of the continents themselves heavily determined human progress. If you look at Europe and Asia, they stretch out on an east-west axis. That means they share similar latitudes and climates. So a crop or a brand new idea developed in the Middle East could spread super easily all the way to France or China. But the Americas and Africa? They stretch north to south. If you want to spread ideas or crops there, you have to cross wildly different climate zones. We're talking going from baking deserts straight into tropical rainforests. And that effectively bottlenecked agricultural innovation for thousands of years.
But, this geographic luck isn't just ancient history. It absolutely still rules our world today. Right now, roughly 90% of global trade relies on cheap transport by ships. So countries with long coastlines and deep water rivers, they have a massive, massive economic advantage over landlocked nations. Simply put, moving goods by water is just exponentially cheaper than hauling them over land.
Moving on to Part 2, Rules of the Game. So, geography is super important, sure, but it is not destiny. Economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson argue that a nation's wealth actually boils down to its invisible systems, its institutions. Think of them as the rules of the game. On one side, you have inclusive institutions. These mean secure property rights, unbiased courts, and open markets. They totally unleash human potential because people know, hey, if I work hard, I'll actually get rewarded for it. But on the flip side, we have extractive institutions. Under these systems, property rights are weak, the law is basically weaponized by the elite, and markets are monopolized. Under extractive rules, everyday folks have zero incentive to innovate because they know any wealth they create is just going to be snatched away. And honestly, this hits the nail on the head for explaining that crazy split in Nogales we saw earlier.
Which brings us to Part 3, Shadows of Colonialism.
So, how exactly did countries end up with such drastically different rules in the first place? Well, when European powers were colonizing the globe, the local climate largely dictated the kind of society they built. In temperate, healthy climates, places like North America or Australia, Europeans settled permanently with their families. And since they were staying for good, they demanded inclusive institutions, parliaments, fair courts, the whole shebang. But in tropical regions teeming with diseases like malaria, like parts of Africa or Latin America, well, Europeans couldn't survive in large numbers. So instead of settling down, they built these brutal, extractive systems using forced labor strictly to strip the region of its gold, its sugar, and just ship all those resources right back to Europe.
And this leads to a pretty tragic legacy that we still see today. When these extractive colonies finally fought for and won their independence, those unfair, exploitative systems weren't always torn down. Instead, a lot of post-colonial leaders just took over the keys to the palace. They found that pre-built infrastructure for extracting wealth from their own citizens was just way too convenient to give up. And that left these deep, deep institutional scars that are incredibly difficult to heal.
All right, let's look at part 4, the paradox of plenty.
Now, you might be wondering, wouldn't discovering oil or diamonds make a poor country instantly rich? You'd think it's a jackpot, right? But often, the exact opposite happens. It's a phenomenon called Dutch disease. So, when a country exports massive amounts of a newly found resource, this crazy flood of foreign money artificially inflates the value of their currency. And the result? All of their other exports, like manufactured goods or farm products, become way too expensive for the rest of the world to buy. Factories close down, farms go bankrupt, and suddenly, the entire economy becomes terrifyingly dependent on the boom and bust cycle of just that one single resource.
But the political danger of this resource curse is arguably even worse. Think about a normal state. Governments have to tax their citizens, right? And that forces leaders to actually listen to the people and build inclusive services. It's a basic social contract. But if a government is funded entirely by drilling oil or mining diamonds, they don't really need to tax the public. So that social contract, it's totally broken. Rulers can just use the resource well to buy military loyalty and build massive palaces, all while the citizens are left in poverty. Power basically devolves into a violent winner-take-all game.
Let's shift gears to part 5, trust and human capital.
So, stepping away from physical resources, we find something completely invisible but incredibly powerful: social trust. Trust acts as the ultimate economic lubricant. In high-trust societies, you can hire a total stranger to do a job and just assume they're going to do it well. Business moves fast, it's cheap, and that allows for the creation of massive, complex corporations. But in low-trust societies, you're forced to spend an absolute fortune on complicated contracts and heavy security. People are terrified of strangers, which means businesses rarely ever grow beyond just small family-run operations.
A perfect example of how to build human capital is the absolute miracle of South Korea. Back in the 1950s, South Korea was incredibly poor and practically devoid of natural resources. But they made this fierce cultural decision to pour absolutely everything they had into educating their citizens. By highly skilling their population, they transitioned from low-wage textiles into heavy industry, and today, they are a high-tech global powerhouse. It completely proves that a nation's true wealth is in the minds of its people, not just what's buried in its soil.
Finally, part 6, the modern wealth machine.
Today, all these historical and geographical factors we've talked about, they all interact on the global stage. To get rich today, a country has to connect to the massive web of global supply chains. But look, multinational companies aren't just going to build factories anywhere. They require strict baseline conditions. We're talking reliable infrastructure like constant electricity, unwavering political stability, and the rule of law so their investments aren't just randomly seized. They also need low corruption, meaning no bribery just to get a permit. Extractive states simply cannot meet these requirements, so they end up entirely locked out of the modern economic machine.
Now, for the countries that do meet those requirements, there's a very clear export-led ladder. It's the exact same ladder the East Asian tigers, places like Taiwan and Singapore, used to lift millions out of poverty in record time. Step 1. They started by providing low-cost, disciplined labor for simple assembly. Then, and this is absolutely crucial, they invested those earnings right back into better ports and better schools. That allowed them to climb up to Step 3, manufacturing complex components. And finally, Step 4, actually designing and branding their own world-class high-tech products.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we can clearly see that the wealth of nations isn't determined by some single magic bullet. It is a rich, deeply interconnected tapestry woven from that starting hand of geography, the legacy of history, the rules of the game, and the cultural glue of trust. And this is exactly why just sending foreign aid to poor countries often fails to produce long-term prosperity. Real development isn't just about throwing money at a physical road. It's about the slow, difficult, internal process of fixing the inclusive rules of the game so that the road doesn't just crumble into corruption down the line.
Geography might have dealt the opening hand, and history certainly cast a very long shadow, but ultimately it's the choices a society makes today that actually define its future. Which leaves us with a really critical question to consider about our own backyards. What rules is your society building today? Are they inclusive rules that unleash everyone's potential, or extractive ones that hold us back?
Please like and subscribe.